I had no particular reason to drive past my brother-in-law's property that Tuesday afternoon. No reason at all, except that my grandson had left his footy boots in the back of my ute the weekend before, and Douglas had mentioned wanting to borrow them for the junior clinic he was running out at Glenmore Park. It was the kind of errand that feels almost too small to bother with, the sort of thing you'd normally put off until the weekend. But I was already heading in that direction after my physio appointment in Penrith, and I thought, well, it's only 10 minutes out of the way. I was 63 years old. I thought I understood my family. I pulled into the long gravel driveway just after 2 in the afternoon. Douglas's silver Hilux was parked out front, along with a white van I didn't recognize. The house was quiet in the way Australian properties often are in the middle of the day, that particular still heat that settles over everything in late summer. A few galahs were making noise in the old gum tree out by the fence line. I grabbed the boots from the back seat, walked up to the front door, and knocked. No one answered. I knocked again and waited, listening. I could hear something, a faint sound, almost like a television playing somewhere deep inside the house. I tried the door handle out of habit. It was unlocked, so I pushed it open a few inches and called out, "Douglas? It's me. It's Arthur." Just dropping off Liam's boots. Nothing. Just that same distant sound. I stepped inside. The front entry was tidy. Douglas was always particular about his home. Always had been. His late wife Margaret had kept the place immaculate, and even 3 years after losing her, he'd maintained her standards out of what I always assumed was grief turned into habit. The kitchen was clean. The living area was empty. I set the boots down by the entrance and was about to call out again when I noticed something on the dining table. A child's drawing. That in itself wasn't unusual. Douglas's grandkids visited sometimes, and there were often colored pencils and scraps of paper left around. But this drawing stopped me because I recognized the handwriting in the corner. Small, careful letters that I had watched being formed over years of homework and birthday cards and school projects. It said, Emmy. My granddaughter had been missing for 11 days. I stood there holding that piece of paper and felt the air leave my lungs. Emily Rose Hartfield was my son, Patrick's youngest. She had been reported missing after she didn't come home from school on a Thursday. The family had been devastated, cycling through hope and dread in the way that only parents and grandparents who have lived that particular nightmare can understand. Patrick had barely slept. My daughter-in-law Carol had lost nearly 4 kilograms in under 2 weeks. And I had been driving around dropping off football boots, feeling useful by doing small things, because large things felt entirely beyond me. The drawing was of a house with a yellow sun and a dog in the garden. At the bottom, in that same careful handwriting, she had written, "I want to go home." My hands were shaking. I put the drawing back exactly where I found it. I don't know why some instinct told me not to disturb anything, not to let whoever was in this house know that I had seen it. I stood very still in that dining room and made myself breathe slowly, the way my doctor had told me to after the cardiac scare 2 years back. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Think. Don't react. Think. The sound was coming from the back of the house. Douglas had renovated extensively about 4 years ago. I remembered the work well because he'd complained about the cost constantly, and I'd helped him move furniture on 2 separate weekends. The renovation had added a large workshop and storage space behind the laundry, a whole extra section that extended back from the original structure. He had made a big deal at the time about the soundproofing he'd put in for his woodworking, because he liked to work late and didn't want to disturb the neighbors. I moved toward the back of the house, staying close to the wall. The laundry door was closed. I pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. On the far wall, next to the old chest freezer, there was a door I had never paid much attention to. I had always assumed it led to a small storage cupboard, but it was slightly ajar, and the sound I had been hearing was coming through it. A child's voice. She was singing quietly to herself. A song I recognized, one of those simple rhymes Carol used to sing at bedtime when the kids were small. I pushed the door open. The room was small and poorly lit, no more than 3 meters by 4. There was a camp stretcher with a sleeping bag on it, a plastic tub of water, some food wrappers, and my granddaughter sitting cross-legged on the floor with a coloring book open in her lap. She was thinner than I had ever seen her. Her hair was unwashed and tangled. She was wearing the same school dress she had disappeared in, though it had been washed at some point. She looked up when the light from the laundry fell across her face. She looked at me for a full 2 seconds without reacting, as though she was trying to decide whether I was real. Then she said very quietly, "I was across that room before I had made any conscious decision to move. I was on my knees on that concrete floor with my arms around her, and she was gripping my shirt with both fists and trembling. I held her and kept my voice as calm as I possibly could, which took everything I had. 'I've got you,' I said. 'I'm here. I've got you.' She was crying without making much sound, which told me she had learned to be quiet in this place. And that realization nearly broke me completely. I pulled back just enough to look at her face. She had a small bruise on her forearm that was fading to yellow. She was pale, but she was alert. She was present. She recognized me. 'Are you hurt?' I asked. She shook her head. 'I'm hungry,' she said. I wanted to pick her up and run. Every fiber of me wanted to do exactly that, carry her out to the ute and drive until I was somewhere safe, and none of this had happened. But I had heard voices while I was moving through the house. Douglas wasn't alone. The white van outside belonged to someone, and if I spooked whoever was in that house before I understood what I was dealing with, I didn't know what might happen. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my 63 years. I told Emmy to stay very quiet, that I would be back very soon, that no one was going to hurt her. I kissed her on the top of her unwashed head, and I stood up and I closed that door softly behind me. Then I walked back through the laundry, through the kitchen, and out the front door, and I stood beside my ute and I called 000. I kept my voice low and even. I told the operator my name and my location. I told her there was a missing child on the property, Emily Rose Hartfield, 9 years old, reported missing 11 days ago from Kingswood, and that she was in a locked room at the rear of the premises. I told her I believed there were at least 2 adults in the house. The operator told me to stay on the line and confirmed that units were being dispatched. I stayed on the line. While I waited, I kept watching the front of the house. My heart was hitting my ribs like something trying to get out, but my hands had stopped shaking. I focused on the galas in the gum tree. I focused on breathing. I had learned in my working life 30 years as a site manager on construction projects across New South Wales that panic is a luxury you cannot afford when other people are depending on you to hold it together. About 4 minutes after my call, the front door opened, and Douglas walked out. He was 61 years old, 2 years younger than me. We had known each other for nearly 30 years. He had been close with my late wife, Sandra, had been at our wedding, at our children's christenings, at Sandra's funeral 6 years ago. He was stocky, gray-haired, a man who had always given the impression of solid reliability. Standing there on his own front step, looking at me beside my ute, his expression shifted through several things very quickly. Surprise, then something that wasn't quite relief, then something harder that I didn't have a name for. "Arthur," he said. "Didn't hear you pull up. Just dropping off Liam's boots," I said. I held up my phone slightly as I spoke, turning my body so he couldn't see that the call was still active. "Thought you might need them for the clinic." "Right." He came down the steps toward me. "Clinic's not until Thursday. Actually, my mistake," I said. "Getting old." He smiled at that, and the smile looked completely normal. And that normality was the most disturbing thing I had encountered that afternoon, which was saying something. "You want a cold drink?" he asked. "I've got someone inside, but we're just finishing up." "Who's the van?" I said, nodding toward it. "Mate from the woodworking club," he said. "Picking up some timber." "Right," I said. "No, I won't stop. Got a doctor's appointment." I looked at him for a moment. I looked at the face of a man I had trusted for 3 decades, and I tried to understand what I was seeing. "You too, mate," he said. I got in the ute. I pulled out of the driveway at normal speed. I turned onto the road and drove 200 meters, and pulled over behind a stand of wattle. "I'm still here," I said into the phone. "Units are 4 minutes away," the operator said. "Do not re-enter the property. Stay where you are." I stayed where I was. The first police car came from the western direction, then a second from the east. They turned onto the driveway within 30 seconds of each other. I pulled out and followed, parking at the end of the driveway. As the officers went up to the door, I watched Douglas answer. I watched his posture change when they told him why they were there. I watched the moment he understood that it was already over. They found Emmy exactly where I had left her, still sitting on the floor with her coloring book. They also found a second person in the house, a man named Trevor, who I had never met, who turned out to have a prior conviction for child endangerment from an earlier part of his life that Douglas had apparently known about. The two of them had been involved in a dispute with Patrick over a property matter, a piece of land that had been part of Sandra's estate, which Douglas believed he had a claim to, and which had been tied up in legal proceedings for the better part of 2 years. Emmy, it became clear, had been taken as leverage. Not to harm Douglas maintained this through everything that followed, and I believe on some level he was telling himself the truth, but to pressure Patrick into settling, as though a child's terror and suffering were a negotiating tool, as though 11 days in a concrete room were an acceptable cost of doing business. The paramedics examined Emmy at the scene, and she was taken to Nepean Hospital as a precaution. She was dehydrated and underweight, but physically uninjured. Patrick arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after I called him. I was in the corridor when he came through the doors running, which I had not seen my son do since he was a teenager, and I pointed him toward her room and stood back and let them have that moment. I sat down in a plastic chair in the hallway, and I stayed there for a long time. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from sustained emotional control. From holding yourself together for hours when every instinct is telling you to fall apart. I felt it settle over me there in that corridor like a weight. My hands, when I looked down at them, were shaking again now that there was no longer any reason not to let them. A young constable came and sat beside me after a while and took my statement. She was patient and thorough, and she thanked me at the end, which I found I had no particular response to. What I kept coming back to, sitting in that corridor, was the moment Douglas had smiled at me in the driveway. The completely ordinary smile of a man who believed he had everything under control. I had known this man at birthday parties and barbecues and footy finals. I had helped him move furniture. I had stood beside him at Sandra's graveside, and none of it, not 30 years of proximity, not the accumulated small kindnesses of a long acquaintance, had given me any window into what he was capable of. That is the thing that stays with you. Not the dramatic moment. Not finding her in that room. The smile in the driveway. Douglas was charged with unlawful confinement of a child and a number of related offenses. Trevor faced additional charges. The property dispute, the piece of land that had apparently been worth all of this, was ultimately settled by the court, and Patrick received the portion Sandra had intended him to have. Emmy came home on a Friday afternoon. She walked into the house she had been taken from 11 days earlier and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking around as though checking that it was still the same place she had left. Then she asked Carol if there was any Vegemite toast because she said the food at the hospital had been terrible. Carol made her 4 pieces. I drove home that evening past the street where Douglas's house was, though it was slightly out of my way. I don't know exactly why. Maybe I needed to see that it was just a house weatherboard and corrugated iron and an old gum tree in the front yard, nothing more or less than that. The sort of house you would drive past every day of your life without a second thought. I have thought a great deal, since that afternoon, about the assumptions we make about the people closest to us. We construct images of the people in our lives, their characters, their values, their limits based on the things they show us, and we rarely examine those images with any rigor because the examination itself feels like a betrayal of the relationship. We trust people because we love them, or because we have known them a long time, or because they have never yet given us a reason not to. And in most cases, that trust is never tested in any serious way. So we never discover whether our image of the person was accurate. Douglas had never given me a reason not to trust him. Not until he gave me every reason. I am not suggesting we should walk through our lives treating the people we love with suspicion. That is no way to live, and it would poison everything good about those relationships. But I think there is a difference between trust and the absence of attention. I think we can love people and still notice them, still pay attention to inconsistencies, to small shifts in behavior, to the things that don't quite fit the image we've built, not with suspicion but with honest curiosity, with the willingness to ask the question we'd rather not ask. Emmy still sometimes wakes up in the night. She is seeing someone who specializes in working with children who have been through frightening experiences, and Patrick tells me she is making progress. She draws a lot. She was always a drawer, even before, and some of what she draws is still the house with the sun and the dog in the garden. But now, more often than not, there are people outside the house too. A family standing together in the garden, underneath that yellow sun. I think about that football boot errand a great deal, about how close I came to not making it, about what would have happened if I had decided it could wait until the weekend. If I had taken a different route home from the physio, if that door had been fully closed instead of slightly ajar, the narrow margin between an ordinary afternoon and the worst outcome imaginable. We talk a lot, in families, about being there for each other, showing up, staying connected, keeping those small threads of contact alive, even when life gets busy and the weeks slip by. I always thought of that in fairly general terms. A phone call when you haven't spoken in a while. Dropping in because you're passing. The small gestures that accumulate into the texture of a family life. I understand it differently now. Sometimes being there is the entire thing. Sometimes it is not symbolic or metaphorical. Sometimes the difference between what happens and what doesn't happen is whether you are physically present on a particular afternoon for no better reason than a pair of football boots left in the back of a ute. If there is anything I would want anyone to take from what happened to our family, it is this: stay connected. Not because something terrible is waiting to happen in all likelihood. It isn't. But because connection is the only thing that makes the bad things survivable and the good things worth having. Because the people in your life deserve your presence, not just your goodwill. Because the small things, the drop-ins, the check-ins, the I was passing and thought of you are not small at all. And if something feels wrong, trust that feeling. Not every uneasy instinct is correct, but no child and no person should ever be beyond reaching. Emmy is 10 now. She starts year 5 in February. She has decided she wants to be a vet, which Patrick thinks is wonderful and which Carol thinks will destroy them financially, and they are probably both right. She comes over most Sundays and we sit in the backyard, and she tells me things about school, about her friends, about the animals she has decided she will one day save, and I listen to all of it, every word. And I do not take a single Sunday for granted. Not one.